Lieutenant-Colonel Francis Adekunle Fajuyi was the first military governor of Nigeria's western region. He was a principled and courageous military leader who was assassinated in the July 1966 coup along with General Aguiyi-Ironsi, Nigeria's head of state. In this edition of Hispo Media, I will tell the story of the assassination of Lieutenant-Colonel Francis Adekunle Fajuyi. I will also answer the questions: was Fajuyi a target for elimination, or did he courageously choose to die while defending his boss and friend, who happened to be the head of state? This video is inspired by a publication on Academia entitled Lieutenant-Colonel Fajuyi, Death and Legacy by Adeyinka Makinde. Welcome to this edition of Hispo Media. Gabriel here. The soldiers who besieged Government House Ibadan in the early hours of Friday, July 29, were propelled by a high sense of vengeance. The soldiers hailed from the northern region and felt aggrieved that several senior Northern Army officers had been assassinated during the coup in January. Significantly, the commanding officer of the Ibadan-based 4th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Abogo Lagema, had been murdered during that coup. Consequently, soldiers of this battalion had refused to obey orders from the officer appointed by Ironsi to replace Lagema because he was Igbo. This act of dissidence, though ignored by Ironsi's regime, was the beginning of what was to come on the day of the murder of Fajuyi and the head of state. So, how did events get to this point? But before we answer this question, do remember to like this video and please take a moment to look for the subscribe button and click on it. It will help this video to reach more people. Thank you. After the coup of January 1966, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Adekunle Fajuyi, an ethnic Yoruba, was appointed by Ironsi as the governor of the western region. He had hosted a cocktail party in the evening of 28th of July to mark the conclusion of Ironsi's nationwide tour aimed at consulting with Nigeria's traditional rulers about the situation in the country. The northern Muslim emirs in particular sought assurances about the direction that the country was heading. Fajuyi, like others in Government House that early morning, were awoken by the sound of gunfire outside the building. He sent messages to the guardhouse and to his ADC, one Lieutenant Umar. Umar was also a northerner. Most of the staff were northerners and were part of the coup which had already claimed the lives of Igbo soldiers at a garrison in the city of Abeokuta. But Umar falsely reported that all was well. Fajuyi met with Ironsi, and it quickly became apparent that they were surrounded by troops with hostile intention. They had taken position from all vantage points. Some soldiers were nestled on treetops, while others lay around the grounds in combat posture. A 106mm gun, an anti-tank weapon, was also positioned in support. The entrances and exits were blocked. They intended for no one to escape. Major Theophilus Danjuma, who was coordinating the siege, resisted calls from impatient NCOs to storm Government House. But he continues to arrest those who intermittently emerge from the building on errands on behalf of the governor and the head of state. His aim, he would later claim, was to arrest Fajuyi and Ironsi. But when Lieutenant Colonel Hilary Njoku, the Igbo commander of the 2nd Brigade in Lagos, was sighted leaving, a burst of machine gun fire was aimed at him. He sustained a leg injury but managed to escape. Frantic calls were placed to officers around the country to explain their dire predicament. An attempt to get a helicopter to rescue them came to nothing. Fajuyi was the first to make his way to the living room, where he paced up and down in full uniform gear. He summoned Ironsi's Air Force ADC Captain Andrew Nwankwo and told him to go outside to find out what was happening. When Nwankwo got outside the building, he met Major Danjuma, who told him that he wanted to see Ironsi. It was during this prolonged tense conversation that Fajuyi came outside to find out why Nwankwo had not returned. Danjuma recounted the following conversation taking place between Fajuyi and himself. Danjuma said, "Sir, you are under arrest. Raise your hands." And Fajuyi replied, "What do you want?" Danjuma said, "I want the Supreme Commander." And then Fajuyi requested, "Promise me that no harm will come to him." Danjuma agreed. However, objections were raised by a number of NCOs who felt that Fajuyi ought to have been detained and not allowed to go back inside. Danjuma noted this and produced a grenade. He informed Fajuyi that if he made a false move, he would blow both of them up. So, Danjuma, with grenade in hand and walking behind Fajuyi, made his way to meet Ironsi in the company of a handful of NCOs. After disarming two police guards at the staircase, they made their way up to the living room, which was situated on the first floor. When they encountered Ironsi, Danjuma saluted him and an argument ensued between both men over Danjuma's complaint that the Ironsi had not kept his promise to court-martial the mutineers of January. But Fajuyi reportedly interjected with repeated reminders that Danjuma had assured Ironsi of his safety. Ironsi was then seized. He was relieved of his trademark crocodile swagger stick and his Major General's rank and shirt were torn from him. Ironsi, Fajuyi, and Ironsi's military aides, Nwankwo and Lieutenant Sani Bello, had their hands tied behind their backs with telephone wires. Danjuma, who had given Fajuyi assurances that there would be no bloodshed, then claimed to have instructed an adjutant of the 4th Battalion to take Fajuyi and Ironsi to a guest house on a nearby cattle ranch. But he recalled an NCO impatiently tapped him on the shoulder with the butt of a rifle and took the prisoners from him. They were then spirited away in two of what formed a convoy of 3 vehicles. He was forced to hitchhike back to the barracks. However, another account has Danjuma entering one of the vehicles and being part of the convoy until waving them on and heading for the barracks. They entered Lulipon, a town on the outskirts of Ibadan, and disembarked at a location on the outskirts of the forest. Fajuyi led the way as he and others, all now stripped of their shirts and repeatedly beaten, were marched along a narrow footpath. When he stumbled and fell as he attempted to cross a small stream, the response of some of his captors was to beat him. By now, both Fajuyi and Ironsi were so weakened by the beatings that they could barely stand up. They were laid face down on the ground before each man was executed with a burst of gunfire. It was a callous and gruesome end. The bodies of both officers were left at the spot of their execution until the next day, when a group of northern soldiers buried them in a shallow grave discovered a few days later by a unit of the police special branch. They were disinterred and reburied at the military cemetery in Ibadan. No official announcement of the death of either man was made by the succeeding government led by Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a Christian northerner who had been Ironsi's chief of staff. A second exhumation would occur at the beginning of 1967 after the meeting between Gowon and Ojukwu in Aburi. Ojukwu was the military governor of the eastern region who disputed the legitimacy of Gowon's regime. Both Fajuyi and Ironsi were accorded state funerals, with each being buried in his hometown. While Fajuyi was buried in Ado-Ekiti, Ironsi was buried in Umuahia. But in the case of Fajuyi, a story of courage and sacrifice began to emerge years later. The story is that northern soldiers who intended to revenge against their Igbo counterpart had no animosity towards Yoruba soldiers. Thus, in the ensuing onslaught, Yoruba officers were largely spared the fate that would befall their Igbo comrades. The modus operandi was to separate Yoruba soldiers and others of non-Igbo ethnicity from Igbo ones before exerting their brand of vengeance on Igbo victims. It is from this background that the widely related story that Fajuyi, who was not meant to die, had informed his captors that if they were going to kill his guests, they would have to do the same to him. While it is true that the Yoruba officers were largely spared the onslaught, the case of Fajuyi was different. First, that was not the story told in the immediate aftermath of his assassination. Indeed, there was little discourse on the murders, since the central government was silent and made no official announcement of his death. Many Nigerians were not aware that he and Ironsi had been killed. However, after his state funeral, much attention began to be focused on Fajuyi's conduct before his execution. This began with a book, Fajuyi the Great, an official publication of the Information Division of the Western Regional Government in 1967. In this book, the narrative of Fajuyi choosing to die with Ironsi firmly entered the realm of public discourse. Over the decades, it was consolidated by other works with titles such as A Great Hero and Tribute to Gallantry. In Fajuyi, the Martyred Soldier, which was published in 1996, the author Sami Ajike recreating the scene where Fajuyi was arrested with Ironsi with the following dialogue. According to him, Fajuyi said, "I make bold to declare to you that I am with you soul, spirit and body. And mark my words, whatever happens to you today happens to me. I am your true friend, dear JTU, like the dove to the pigeon. And by the grace of our good God, so will I humbly, yet proudly remain till the very end." Then Ironsi replied, "Yes, Francis, I retain my absolute confidence in you. I have never for once doubted your integrity." So, is it likely that this dialogue would have happened following the tense and chaotic circumstances of the arrest of both men? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Meanwhile, none of those who were involved in Fajuyi's arrest have ever claimed that Fajuyi was asked to stand aside while Ironsi was taken away. Indeed, according to William Welby and Theophilus Danjuma, Fajuyi was specifically earmarked for death because he was believed by the mutineers to have had a hand in the planning of the first coup. They also heard that Fajuyi had acted to block any attempt to bring the January coup plotters to trial. William Welby had this to say, quote, "We arrested him as we arrested Ironsi. We suspected him of being party to the January coup. You remember the battle group course which was held at Abeokuta. Fajuyi was the commander of the battle group course. All those who took part in the January coup were those who had taken part in that course. It gave us the impression that the battle group course was arranged for the January coup, so he had to suffer it too. I am sorry about that, but that is the nature of the life of a military man." According to Danjuma, Fajuyi was also in charge of another training camp in the northern town of Kachia. This was reportedly at the time Major Nziogu conducted exercise Damisa, which northern officers subsequently interpreted as a mock exercise for the attack on the residence of Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto. Danjuma had this to say, quote, "The chaps could not stomach Fajuyi, such that if there was anybody who should die first, as far as they were concerned, it was Fajuyi, not even Ironsi." However, historians have concluded that both Danjuma and Welby's accounts are riddled with inaccuracies. For instance, Fajuyi was not involved in the Kachia training camp, which took place in mid-April 1966 when Nziogu was in detention. And while Danjuma may have mistaken the training camp for that of the battle group course held in September 1966, only one of the 7 instructors, Major Adewale Ademoyega, and one of the 13th attendees, Captain Ben Bulie, were participants in the January coup. Many of the officers who attended were from the northern region. Nevertheless, in the atmosphere of distrust and rumor-mongering as existed in the army in the build-up to the counter-coup, factual information often took a back seat. Notwithstanding, evidence of Fajuyi's involvement in the January coup would come from one of the 5 leading majors, Major Adewale Ademoyega. In his book, Why We Struck, Ademoyega, a Yoruba and the only known Igbo among the coup plotters, claimed that Fajuyi was aware and supported the coup. He also made suggestions to the plotters on the best way to carry out the coup. According to him, the only reason why Fajuyi was not an active participant was because of a posting. Importantly, he confirmed that Fajuyi actually opposed all effort made by the Ironsi-led Supreme Military Council to bring the plotters to trial. So, giving a more accurate account of Fajuyi, the event of July 29th, and the lead-up to the counter-coup on that day arguably does not diminish this courageous officer. It is clear that Fajuyi acted in a physically courageous way when he stepped outside of the State House to confront the rebellious soldiers and to ascertain what had happened to Captain Nwankwo, Ironsi's ADC. It is also very clear that he believed as a matter of honor that he was morally duty-bound to do what was necessary to protect his guest, General Aguiyi-Ironsi. This informed his repeated entreaties to Major Danjuma to assure him that no harm would come to Ironsi. Just like Major General Aguiyi-Ironsi, Lieutenant Colonel Fajuyi was a veteran of the United Nations peacekeeping operation in the Congo. On November 27, 1960, Fajuyi led his company in combat and would become the first Nigerian officer to be awarded international military citation for his role. Major Fajuyi was awarded the Military Cross for actions in North Katanga and the operation in which he extricated his unit from an ambush on January 3, 1961. It is therefore safe to conclude that the story of Fajuyi gallantly choosing to die was possibly created with the intention of emphasizing the virtue of bravery in the face of the army's barbarism. So what is your thought on this? Let me know what you think in the comment section. For more stories like this, please click here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hispo Media, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much for watching. Peace.